Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the lead up to the Renaissance period, right? Now, the big thing about it is we covered a lot of stuff in that last flip, right? A lot of stuff that's honestly, some of y'all probably wouldn't even learn in a college classroom, right? We were talking a lot about some different things, like, for example, the fall of ancient Rome, how only half of it really actually fell, the fall of Rome and its equation to the beginning of this time period known as the Middle Ages, right? Now, the big thing about it that some of y'all are probably thinking to yourselves is like, Mr. Terry, I went to the College Board, the CED, also known as the Course and Exam Description, that basically the College Board tells us the stuff that we need to go over so y'all can pass this test, which is the stupidest document I've ever seen in my life, and I will say that publicly. All right, so now the big thing about it, though, is that y'all might have gone and looked at that bad boy and realized that the Middle Ages isn't even in the curriculum itself. Yes, but context to the lead-up if it is, right? Context to the Renaissance and understanding where it came from, why it was called the Renaissance, right? Why it's considered a dramatic shift in gears to, like, as opposed to the Middle Ages that came before it, right? And the other big thing about it is this entire unit, a lot of it is kind of the the egg that leads to the chicken that we'll talk about in the grand scheme of things, right? But where we left off, we were talking about the the early Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, right? And we got into the political structure of things, right? We started talking about feudalism and this goofy system of land ownership that they had, known as feudalism, that would actually hold on, y'all, in Europe for so long. It was there for 1,000 years, right? Because it began in the 700s with the raids of these Vikings, right? And then literally the last country to get rid of feudalism was Russia in 1861. The same year our Civil War started in America, just to give you some kind of understanding of how literally Europe was just resistant to change for quite some time, right? And we also talked a little bit about, though, how feudalism and the feudal system actually kept monarchs very weak, right? We started talking about this example known as the Magna Carta. You better have done it. You better have done it just instinctually, all right? So now, look, the big thing about it, though, okay, going into it, we talked about that document and how it's going to limit the power of a king and stuff like that, and how King John was basically forced at the tip of a sword by a bunch of nobles to sign this document saying that he couldn't imprison people without cause, he couldn't take property, that he actually had to revert to a council of nobles and bishops and priests, the seeds of the early parliament, to get tax raises approved and things like that, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is we're now entering into that time period that you would call, like, right before the Renaissance itself, right? We're in the late 1200s into the 1300s, and the Renaissance is sort of kind of begins at 1450, right? Now, the curriculum for the course begins at 1450. The thing about the whole Renaissance Middle Ages thing is, where does it start? Where does it stop? And all this other stuff. But we'll get into all that as we keep progressing forward. But this right here is the Europe that we're dealing with at this point, right? Now, you'll notice really quickly while going ahead and taking a gander at it, you're like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, this isn't like the map that I have to fill in for my summer assignment. Don't forget to do that, right? You need to know where those major rivers are. It's just a little reference map so you can get a little bit more used to the political outlines of modern-day Europe, right? You need to know famous cities, right? Literally, I had a child look at me the other year and go like, Mr. Terry, what's Moscow? That's unacceptable in this class, right? You need to know the Moscow's in Russia. All right, so now look. But going into it, though, this right here is the Europe we're dealing with, right? This is the Europe of the High Middle Ages, okay? And you'll notice that it does look a little bit different. It's got some other kind of goofy, like country names on there. Like, for example, Russia doesn't even exist yet, right? We've got the Kingdom of Poland, Kingdom of Hungary, right? You've got this place right here known as the Holy Roman Empire. France is there. England's there. Hurrah. So, and some other things that you actually have seen of before, right? We'll get into this guy down here in about 2 seconds that's known as a caliphate, right? Which is actually a little kingdom of the Muslim Empire, right? Now, but going into it, though, that's the Europe that we're dealing with, right? And the thing that we need to understand is that Europe, right? That Europe in general, right? That was kind of like a loose conglomeration of states. A lot of countries that you know of, like, for example, Italy didn't even exist yet. Fun fact, by the way, Italy doesn't exist until 1861. Yeah, it's a pretty young concept, this united Italy kind of thing. But going into it, though, the early and high Middle Ages that you saw on that map right there have one common theme that kind of unites all of those kingdoms, those principalities, and those places together, right? And it's the simple fact of the matter that intellectual output was a little on the low side, right? Now, brilliance wasn't really emerging out of the High Middle Ages like some medieval scholars want to believe it was. Like, some of the medieval scholars will defend this tooth and nail and be like, oh, the Middle Ages is just as important as ancient Rome, and it's got just as much amazing art and blah. And I disagree. I disagree. So for any of y'all that want to fight me in the comments, please don't. Now the big thing about it though is that the intellectual output by comparison to the Renaissance was relatively low, right? And then also going forward as well, economics were not terribly high, right? Now, the High Middle Ages was seeing a return of economics. We were seeing a growth in economics. We were seeing people making, by the way, economics is like the science of making money, for those of you who don't know. Now, the biggest thing about it, though, is that it was coming back. It was getting better, right? So it was going in the right direction. However, by comparison to other places, it just was not up to snuff, right? And when I say by comparison to other places, something you need to keep in the back of your mind before we get into all this exploration stuff that gets really kicked off in the 1490s and 1470s, you have to understand that this is in heavy contrast to the East, right? Now, Europe is what you would consider a Western civilization or a Western area, right? Western civilizations and Western countries are all areas that have been affected by Europe and its culture, right? So basically where like European like cultural values and European culture itself has kind of been impressed upon people, that's usually like a Western civilization, okay? So for example, America is a Western civilization, right? Europe, in general, all of it is Western, right? Whereas you might actually look to other places like Asia, area like Asia, or excuse me, let me try that again, wrap it back up. You might look at places like Asia. You might look at places like the Pacific Islands and stuff like that. You also might look at Southwest Asia, also commonly known as the Middle East, right? Those are more of your Eastern civilizations, right? Which actually hold a lot of different values and culturally do things a lot differently from Western civilizations, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that during the Middle Ages that some people have referred to as a dark age, right? Things were going not so well for Europe. But the Eastern civilizations were having a great time, right? From about 500 AD to about 1450 AD, it was a time period where the Eastern empires were killing it. All right, so I sometimes refer to this as the Monsoon Marketplace or the Eastern Golden Age, right? Now, the Eastern Golden Age is also a heavily academic concept that a lot of people actually discuss and talk about, that the countries and like kingdoms and the like dynastic empires that existed in the eastern territories of the world, right, that you would look at with the modern day map and stuff like that, our Mercator map especially. The thing about it, though, is that the eastern areas were really, really growing in wealth, in intelligence, and in art, and in all of these different philosophical trends and things like that, all right? In contrast to the Europeans, who were kind of spinning their wheels a little bit, right? So the thing about it that you have to get a little bit of a handle on is that the Indian Ocean was a massive trade hub that had little to no involvement of Europeans during their medieval period, okay? So like when you look at the Indian Ocean on a map itself, right, that ocean that is to the east of Africa, right to the south of India, and of course right over to, or underneath and over to towards the east, towards China, it's a very large body of water, right? Some people and some historians refer to it as the Monsoon Marketplace because literally the Eastern empires are going to learn how to ride monsoon winds. By the way, monsoons are not rain; they're actually winds, seasonal winds that change direction throughout the year. Okay, and so these monsoon winds could easily be sailed back and forth, and they were carrying items from Eastern Africa and places like Ethiopia, all the way back to places like China, where they would trade these major stores in luxury items that the rest of the world kind of really wanted, right? But it actually was like so expensive that many medieval Europeans couldn't afford them. Some of these goods that they were trading in this area include things like silk, that I'm sure a lot of y'all have heard of before, which is a fabric that is made by worms, all right? And these worms actually are like usually in Asia, right, in East Asia, and they exist in caves, right? They make cocoons, you boil the cocoon, you kill the worm, you thread the cocoon itself, makes silk, right? And silk is a very non-perishable item, right? It's not like cotton and it gets eaten by moths. Silk, on the other hand, lasts for a very, very long time, and it can be very, very easily dyed and pressed and actually have different patterns embroidered upon it, right? And it's a luxury item. It's beautiful. It's soft. Y'all know what it is, right? Now, so intercoastal trading is another thing that's going to be going on as well. Scientific advancement is going to be spreading also because there's something that you need to kind of go ahead and get inside your mind real quick a little bit, all right? Something that you need to kind of embed in your psyche that you shouldn't even have to write down. You can if you want to, but this Eastern area and this Eastern Golden Age, by comparison to the Middle Ages, is a very good example of this concept that you might have heard of before known as cultural diffusion, right? Cultural diffusion is when countries trade trade or go to war, and their ideas spread, right? Like, so they like cross paths, right? For example, if you trade with somebody and you see something they have, you're gonna be like, oh, what is this thing that you actually are like making and stuff like that? This is a hair tie. It's one of my wife's, right? Like, no, so, but think about it though, okay? When we're looking at this, I'm gonna ask questions, right? And then as we communicate and trade back and forth, I'm gonna learn how to make this stuff from somebody who's traded it with me, right? Scientific advancement is gonna grow and it's gonna trade throughout this Eastern area this entire time, right? And also, do you think that a little bit later on, getting towards the 1450s, that the Europeans are gonna see this and notice this and wanna get in on the game? Exactly. Keep that in the back of your mind, all right? But scientific advancement examples include the creation of gunpowder that actually was created in 900 AD, or right around 900 AD in ancient China, right? So like now, so not ancient, but pre-modern China. Well, it's not even really pre-modern. They were doing a lot better than the Europeans. China. So like now, like so, salt was a big thing that was being traded as well from Africa. Gold was coming from all over these different areas. The preservation of Greek and Roman texts. Some of you are like, wait a minute, Mr. Tower, those are Europeans. Yes, you are correct, that is true, but a lot of these different goods and items were actually held onto in libraries and in different areas in the East, right? Because Constantinople was actually towards what you know of now as modern-day Turkey, right? Like, so like now, Constantinople is now currently a city known as Istanbul, right? If you need a way to remember that, some of y'all probably heard this song before.
Istanbul was Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, not Constantinople, been a long time gone. Constantinople, now it's Turkish delight on a moonlit night. Every gal in Constantinople.
Exactly, right? Istanbul was Constantinople. Now, so like going into it though, the preservation of these items and these texts actually were held onto by a lot of Arabic traders, right? Because they actually came into a contact with a lot of this stuff and they actually translated these writings into Arabic. Many Arabic scholars refer to Aristotle, a Greek like scientist and a Greek philosopher, as the first philosopher, right? And they actually used his ideas to influence their teachings, right? So the going into it as well, philosophy began to grow. Spices, you need to highlight that one, right? Spices is a big deal. It's going to be traded all over these different areas. Algebra was created by the Arabs, right? I know some of you are like, ugh. Calm down, all right? I didn't mind algebra when I was in high school. And also even the number 0 was created during this time period. So as you can tell, all of these amazing advancements were going on in the East during the same time period that the Middle Ages was happening in the West, right? So now going into it though, also, you have to understand as well, you're going to see the expansion of a very large empire that's going to need to kind of just be something in the back of your mind, right? And it is known as the Muslim caliphates, right? Now, Muslim expansion is going to happen very, very heavily as about 700 AD/CE, when you're going to see the rise of Muhammad around 610 CE, okay? So about 100 years before this massive expansion, a guy showed up out of the desert and his name was Muhammad, right? And Muhammad actually carried with him the writings and teachings of a new religion, right? And this religion actually was heavily related to Christianity in a lot of different ways because they actually themselves do consider Christ to be a prophet, right? And so the thing about it that we're looking at it though is that they consider Muhammad to be the last prophet, right? Okay, and then Muhammad is going to actually carry this new idea of a one God system, right, under the like leadership of a God known as Allah, and it's going to begin to spread dramatically. It's going to unite Arab tribes together. It will be the glue that binds them together, and they create large armies, and they begin to actually create a very large kingdom, right? And so as you can see during this entire like time period, Islamic cultures and Islamic kingdoms are spreading very rapidly, right? Starting out here in the red right here with Saudi Arabia, modern day Oman and Yemen. It began to then spread throughout what you know as Southwest Asia or the Middle East, all the way through North Africa, and even into Spain, right? Like, so now this is going to be a really big deal a little bit later on because literally the Spanish monarchs under Isabella and Ferdinand are going to be pushing the like the Muslims out of Spain during this thing called the Reconquista. And we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about new monarchs and how new monarchies are going to actually kind of try and use their force and their power and will to push these people out, right? These like the kingdoms of the Muslim territories. But look right here, okay? Look at the architecture. Look at the wardrobe. Look at the trade emphasis, right? Look at the silks and like all of the different items that are inside and like of this image, and you can see that the Eastern kingdoms were very prosperous during this time period, where the Middle Ages Europeans were really struggling. And this right here is actually in Cordoba, Spain, which is actually the like the remnants of Muslim architecture that actually still stands there today, and you can go and see it, right? So there's a lot of emphasis of these things at the time. Now, so what the Middle Ages, though, okay, like you have to understand, though, is while all that's going on in the East, this is why this course is tough, okay? Like, so just to give you a little bit of a heads up, this course can be a little hard, okay, when it comes to keeping track of all the information, just because you have to know what's going on in multiple different places at the same time, within the same time period, right? And that's where a lot of people get tripped up, right? So you got to just kind of keep in the back of your mind that while the Europeans are going through the Middle Ages and their economics and intellectual output is not very good, the Easterners are having a great boom, and they're trading things like silks and spices, and they're developing algebra, and they have all this different scientific advancement, because that's going to come into major play when we start talking about the voyages of the Portuguese, and we also start talking about the voyages of the Spanish in a period that you know of as the period of exploration, quote unquote, right? So now look, but while all that's going on for the Easterners, right, the late Middle Ages or the Middle Ages is still chugging along, okay? But now what we're going to see, though, is we're going to begin to leave the High Middle Ages and go into the Late Middle Ages, right? So you're going to see a little bit of a transference, right? Right around the period of 1000 AD, right? So you're going to see a little bit of a shift from what you would call the High Middle Ages into the Late Middle Ages, right? Now, the period of time where the Late Middle Ages stops and the Renaissance begins is very fuzzy. It's very gray, right? So it's extremely gray. So when we're looking at the both of them kind of encapsulated together, right? So the Late Middle Ages and the Renaissance period, what were they truly then? Well, if you really look at the Easterners as an archetype, as a cookie cutter for what brings about progress and scientific advancement, literature and art and stuff like that, it all boils down to one thing. It's money. It's economics that is the driving force behind all of this stuff, right? Because the Easterners are able to produce great pieces of philosophical text. They're able to jump forward in mathematics because of the economic backbone of their kingdoms, right? Because the economics are actually then going to be able to fuel intellectual development, because you're going to have people that can pay these smart people to be even smarter. So that's going to be bringing up the ideas of patronage. We'll get into that in a little while, right? Now, the thing about it, though, what you're going to see, though, okay, particularly speaking, okay, what you're going to see is you're going to see the growth of Italian commerce, finance, and banking during this time period, right? Now, Italians are going to do it first, and it's going to then spread to the rest of Europe, right? And it's going to kind of bring the Renaissance along with it, right? Now, during this time period, though, we have to understand that the Middle Ages made money in a very certain way, right? And it was using that feudal system. Money was made through taxation, land holdings, and trade, but the trade was pretty sparse, right? The trade wasn't very intercontinental, right? It wasn't going into a lot of different places. They weren't carrying luxury items. They didn't have all kinds of really big artisan goods, right? It was minor trade, but mostly held in land and taxes, right? So in agricultural output. But what you're going to see, though, is over time, as the late Middle Ages begins to grow a little bit, and trade starts coming up a little bit, and things are starting to get a little bit better, and of course, naturally, sciences develop, and naturally, art develops, and naturally, I'll give it to you medieval scholars out there, right? Naturally, things begin to develop, and things are getting a lot better. What's going to happen is a lot of these lords, nobles, traders, guild workers are going to begin to invest their capital back into their company. And as the profits grow, the gap between the wealthy and the poor begin to grow rapidly, which you are seeing a return of economics to Europe itself, right? As that capital begins to get reinvested. Now, where is a lot of this money being made? Well, a lot of it's being made in the growth of the guild systems during the Middle Ages, okay? Now, guilds are going to be really, really important a little bit later on, because in the 1700s, we're going to talk about how they got outlawed, right? We're going to talk about how they were considered stifling to the economy. Well, in the Middle Ages, they were considered a reinvigoration of the economy, right? Guilds were needed in the Middle Ages to kind of boost everything forward and bring some power and money back to the Europeans, right? Now, how do they work exactly, and what is a guild, right? How would you say that this is like baby capitalism early on, right? Well, the thing about it, though, is guilds, in essence, what they are sworn associations of people together, right? They are sworn associations of professionals that come together, that unite to protect and set up a price of their product and avoid unjust taxation and fines, right? So what a guild is, just to give you a heads up, is you basically get together with a bunch of people that do the same thing that you do, right? Let's say, for example, one of you is a blacksmith, right? Okay, you make items out of metal, right? You would get together with several other blacksmiths, and instead of competing with one another anymore, you get together and you form what's known as a smithing guild, right? And the guild comes together, and not only do you protect one another and set a price on your product that you believe is fair to keep you from undercutting one another, you also train young apprentices who pay membership to be in the guild, and so this whole thing keeps on rolling forward. Do you see what I'm talking about? And if you are teaching apprentices, those apprentices are developing new techniques and things, and we got now, you see what I'm talking about, economics stimulates innovation, right? That is a literal thing about capitalism in general, and how the way the world works in an economic system is that economics fuel innovation, right? Because literally someone's trying to develop a better and easier and faster way to do a thing so they can make more money off of it, right? And so the guilds came together in the Middle Ages and they began to make guilds of everything, right? You had smithing guilds, you had carding guilds that were literally just in charge of like splitting wool apart, right? You had what are the other ones? You had cobblers guilds who made shoes. You had like guilds of every type you can imagine, right? And they came together so they could actually set a price on their product. Now, when you look at guilds in general, there are two big types of them, all right? There's two huge umbrella terms that when you break guilds up into two categories, you've got merchant guilds and craft guilds, right? Now, the one that I've been talking about a lot is craft guild, right? But out of these two, which do you think is going to grow in wealth the fastest and make the most money, right? Now, some of you are probably like, well, you just did go on a rant about craft guilds in general, about like smithing and making things, right? So I'd imagine that one, right? No. Merchant guilds are going to grow much faster, okay, and much more profitable than craft guilds will, right? Because merchant guilds are the ones who are carrying the items being made, right? Almost all wealth still resided in kings, feudal lords, and the church, but these guilds are beginning to grow, right? And if these guilds are beginning to grow and people are beginning to have an economic option outside of feudalism, you're going to see the population of serfs begin to decrease and the population of peasants and guild workers begin to increase, right? So you see what I'm talking about? We've got a decrease in economic stagnation and increase in economic revival, right? And this revival is going to be the thing that feeds the Renaissance, right? It feeds into it and it begins to grow wealth inside of Europe, okay? And you're going to see where all this is going in about 2 seconds. Now, how merchant guilds made their money, though, and how they're going to be able to make their money and kind of reinvigorate the economy that is the European economy during the late and high Middle Ages that was very stagnated is going to be very important, right? And the way they do this is by importing and exporting those Eastern goods that we were just talking about, all right? Do you see what I'm saying, y'all? Do you see what I'm getting at? That's why we had to talk about those things, right? I need you to know now, early on in this course, that everything comes back up later, okay? Like, everything is referenced back to. Like, there's a guy that we're going to talk about in the Renaissance named Machiavelli that literally we will talk about until the course is over, okay? You have to be able and ready to reference back to something we talked about and talk about how it influenced something later on, okay? So the thing about it is those Easterners who were trading all of those really, really refined luxury goods, right? Those things that they had that nobody else had because silkworms only exist in East Asia, right? So, like, now, you need to understand, though, by importing and exporting those goods, these Europeans can make some money, right? Because they're luxury items there. They're worth lots of money. Things like Chinese porcelain, things like spices are going to be very important later on. Spices. Say it with me. Spices. Why are spices going to be so important? We'll get to that later, but it makes a lot of different stuff. For example, okay, if you go to the Netherlands, the Dutch people have a phrase that still exists inside of their language, right? It's just a very common idiom, and literally it said, oh, that thing you're talking about, it's pepperly expensive, right? Pepperly expensive means that the item that I'm referring to is really expensive, right? Because in the Netherlands, during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period, and even in the 1500s, if you had pepper, black pepper on your table, it was like having a Ferrari in the garage, right? Because that's how you like flexed on people, because literally the stuff was so pricey, right? That's how much it cost to get it there. So if you had it, I mean, you were wildly wealthy, right? And so even in the Dutch language, there's a saying that's like, oh, it's pepperly expensive, right? That still even holds on to this day, right? So going into it, though, spices were a very large Eastern luxury item. Another one was that silk stuff, right? And of course, we have teas, which are going to be very important later on because tea is mostly grown in Southeast Asia and also in an island off the coast of India known as Sri Lanka, right? Like, now going into it, though, these are luxury items, right? So they fetch a very high price. That's why those merchant guilds were able to grow so fast. And the other grand thing about this stuff, y'all, is it's non-perishable. This stuff doesn't go bad, right? So now, like, so porcelain's not going to go bad. Silk's not really going to turn or taint. What's going to happen with spices is they are dried, so they stay very, very long inside of a warehouse, right? This is warehouse inventory, right? The thing about it is, like, you are now not moving, like, agricultural items from, like, a small fief or a feudal land, right, or something like that in the Kingdom of England that can go bad at any minute, because if the grain turns, what's going to happen is you can't make bread out of moldy grain or you might die or get this thing called ergot poisoning, which makes you go a little crazy. But the thing about it, though, that you need to understand is that these items can be held on to for long periods of time, right? And so once the merchants had them in their possession, they could sell them and they could use the market demand and fluctuations to actually sell them for higher prices, right? So going into it, though, what's going to happen is like the High Middle Ages is churning along, right? The Late Middle Ages is beginning and you're seeing a return of economics through the piggybacking off of the Easterners, right? Back into Europe again. And so you're thinking to yourself, oh, the Renaissance has to be right around the corner. Give it a minute, all right? So, like, the late Middle Ages, though, was defined by something very, very intense. And some of you are like, why is European history so hard? Just give me a second. Like, so now, look, so the thing about it, though, that you need to understand is that the late Middle Ages is not a time of progress all of a sudden. Even though economics were returning, the late Middle Ages is characterized by tragedy, terrible events, and hardship, right? Like, so the late Middle Ages was wrought, like just wrought with like all different kinds of really bad events that actually kind of kept the economy from really like just hitting the ground running. The Renaissance could have probably started a couple hundred years earlier if the late Middle Ages didn't kind of play out the way that it did, right? Because you got a lot of terrible events that went down. Like, for example, there were these massive climatological shifts that were actually going on during the late Middle Ages. This period known as the Little Ice Age popped up during the late Middle Ages, causing massive crop failures and famines that swept through different parts of Europe throughout, like the 1300s, right? Like, one of the worst ones was the famine of 1315 to 1317, right? That actually predated a very, very bad epidemic that y'all also know of as well. But you're going to also see wars between nobles, right? Nobles are beginning to have full-scale warfare with each other in what you would probably consider a civil war at the time, right? One of the most famous ones is known as the War of the Roses, right? The War of the Roses claimed so many lives in England because two different royal houses were fighting with each other. You had the Yorks and the Lancasters, and the reason why they were actually fighting with each other is because they were fighting over the throne of England, right? Because the last leader, Edward the Confessor, had died without any actual. No, that's in the 1066. I'm sorry for the medieval scholar who's like no, stop it. So now the very, very last Plantagenet leader, all right, died, and what happened is that these two different leaders, I think it was Richard. So now, anyway, so I'm not sure if it's Richard, but I'm gonna look it up. But the thing about it that ends up happening is these two royal houses, all right, these two noble houses, the Yorks and the Lancasters, fight each other, and the reason why it's called the War of the Roses is because they both had roses in their royal crests, right? So now one was white and one was red, all right? So now the thing about it, though, going into it, is that these wars cost a lot of lives, and when you have wars going on that are sweeping entire areas, it stifles economies, and trade routes don't run as effectively, and it kind of keeps things from really getting on the move on, right? So another big one that actually happened that kind of signals the beginning of the Renaissance is when this war right here ended, right? This war known as the 100 Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453, right? And that 100-year-long war, which some of you are doing math in your head, really, that's 116 years. It is 116 years. Good math. I'm actually very impressed. So now the thing about it, though, is they actually called it the 100 Years' War because it just plays out better like that. But it's a 100-year-long war between France and England. Some of you actually have probably heard of it before because you know of Joan of Arc, and Joan of Arc actually fought in this war and actually helped lead France to victory, right? In a way, all right? She helped turn the tides of the war, especially itself. I was actually in Rouen this past summer, which is where she actually died, right, in France. So going into it, though, the 100 Years' War is a very large-scale war as well that's going to help stifle the economy. And another big one that a lot of you have actually heard of before is this this disease known as the Black Death that actually happened during the 100 Years' War and actually slowed it down for a little bit. It actually happened in 1347 to about 1350, right? Claiming the lives of upwards of 3 million Europeans, right? And so now the Babylonian captivity period, which is this thing known as the Great Western Schism, was also going down as well. And what that is in general is literally when there was a split in the church and there were multiple popes. Like, I kid you not, y'all, there were multiple popes. Like, at one point in the late Middle Ages, there were two different popes. And the one pope was like, I'm the real pope, not that guy. And the other one was like, no, I'm the real pope, not that guy. And it all started with these guys named Clement and Urban. So Clement and Innocent. All right, so he wasn't so innocent. But the thing about it, though, going into it, all right, is that this Great Western Schism, known as the Babylonian Captivity, split things in Europe along a lot of different political lines, right? And the other big thing that's going to be happening in the late Middle Ages as well is these ongoing crusades. There are these wars against the Muslim empires to try and retake the Holy Land of Jerusalem, right? Now, the thing about it that's really, really interesting is all those terrible and tragic events you would think would destroy the economy permanently and set them backwards for a really long time. But what it actually did is it actually boosted the economy forward. Now, I know some of you are like, I thought you said just a second ago, Mr. Terry, it kept it from getting going. Well, it kind of did. Like, if y'all ever, like, actually gotten into a car that needs time to warm up when it's really, really cold outside, right? These events, right, were kind of like that waiting period where you're just waiting for it to get warm, but then it gets so hot you got to turn it down, right? Like, so, like, that's what's going to end up happening, okay? The craziest thing is that economic develops didn't slow down and have to recover. They actually leapt forward after those late Middle Ages events, right? After the Black Death, after the Crusades, after the interaction between the Muslims and the Christian leaders, and seeing the cultural diffusion that could happen between the two of them, actually led to a massive leap forward in economics, because it led to the disruption of the manorial system. And the manorial system is the feudal system, all right? But it's also known as the manor system, so just don't break your brain, all right? But the manorial system is going to be disrupted, and you're going to see some serfs that are able to leave now, and they're going to actually go join up with some of these guilds, and you're going to see these people actually, like, also being able to, like, go and make money, right? So, like, now you saw a disruption in the church, right? And the church is actually going to be a heavy political stifling thing that was around during the Middle Ages, and the disruption of its organization is going to actually allow some of that money to kind of just exist in the continent, right? And then also less people, right? A lot of people died during this, all right? So since a lot of people died during this, you've got smaller markets, keener competition, and since you have less people, right, I can demand more money for my work now, right? So now that we're not all competing with each other, and if I'm joining a guild, I'm setting a price on my product, right? So ironically enough, these terrible things that went down throughout the Middle Ages are going to actually grow the economy significantly, right? You're also going to see new trade routes open up, and you're going to see new ships pop up as well that can go further than they ever have before. And the reasons why is because of the communications with the Arabs, and also as well as the people of the Southwest Asia, who actually had all of these new, like, kinds of caravel-style ships that could travel long distances and carry large loads, right? You also had multi-level trading systems, right, where you had this thing called the Comenda system, which is a middleman actually inside of the system itself, who would actually, like, carry goods from one end to one location to the other. If you had somebody in Venice who had silk, and you had somebody in Norway who needed it, the Comenda system was the guy that would actually take it there for you, right? Like, I would just be like, oh, I'll pick it up and I'll take it, right? Like, you will pay me to ship it, I will sell it back to them at a slightly marked up price, and that's how the middleman makes his money, right? And so you're seeing a growth of a multi-leveled economy, right? You've also going to see family firms pop up, which is going to be really important as we get into this, right? And you're seeing the rise also of financial techniques, right? Family firms is pretty obvious, right? You got families that are cornering the market in certain goods and services, right? And the rise of new financial techniques is going to pop up though as well. You got double entry bookkeeping, right? Which literally is this idea of showing in a book how much you're making versus how much you're losing, right? Because literally a credit means he owns and a debit means he trusts, right? So, like, or he owes and trusts. And so going into it, you got credit, loans are being popped up, bills of exchange, money lenders with interest, and you see the rise of banks as well, right? And this right here is the Europe of the Renaissance as things begin to grow, right? And as you can see, some of our borders are changing. Some of these 100 Years' Wars have actually changed things quite heavily. But going into it, a lot of the stuff that's going on in the Renaissance is going to be centered right there. Okay, it's going to happen mostly in the place that you know of is Italy, right? Now, what's going to happen, though, is you're going to see the establishment of a lot of these new Italian republics, right? Okay, so you saw the establishment of Italian republics as they began to rise to power, right? Now, early on, they started as these things called communes, right? And due to the disruption of the late Middle Ages, okay, due to all those crazy events like the Black Plague, the Crusades, the wars, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines is another big one that you don't need to know about, but it was literally a war between, like, different factions of the church and stuff like that. You saw these communes start popping up in these cities in northern Italy, right? And these communes are going to be the nest that the, like, idea of the Renaissance grows out of, right? So, like, it's going to be the flower bed that brings forth these fruits, right? And what they were, though, is they're areas free of feudalism, right? The idea is that the commune was supposed to be an area that was sworn associations of free men. No one was going to be bound to the land by a contract. No one was going to have to do any of that stuff. And they were going to be actually free men that were going to be regulated. They were going to regulate trade together, collect taxes together, and then they would maintain city walls and protect their own area. Now, the problem was that it grew very, very wealthy very, very quickly, and you did see a class divide, right? Because the thing that a lot of these communes were started out very altruistically as this idea of, like, oh, we will all be of the same class, and That doesn't ever happen. Like, so like history has showed us that literally communes will turn into despotism, and like you're gonna see people with more money move in, and you're gonna see like basically like, kind of a weird little economic feudalism in and of its own. Like for example, this right here is a city inside of northern Italy known as San Gimignano, right? And I've been to San Gimignano before, but it's really, really funny when you look at the skyline of San Gimignano, you see all these medieval towers everywhere, right? Well, the funny thing about it is like there was originally only one, and it was owned by one family, right? Well, another family moved in and started making a lot of money, and so they literally built their tower just a little bit higher, right? So like now, and then another family moved in, and they were like, oh no, we got a little bit more money, so we're gonna build our tower a little bit higher. And so like it actually kind of shows you that there's beginning to be a slight class divide in these communes and stuff like that. Even though it's free of feudalism, it doesn't mean that we don't have very wealthy families inside of them, right? And what's going to happen is these wealthy families are going to actually have to put down a couple of large-scale revolts, okay? There are these people called the Popolo that were like the poor like community in these Italian communes, and they had these like big uprisings, right? They had these really big uprisings and revolts, and they were like, we demand republic-style governments, right? And a republic is actually is a government that's ruled directly by the people. And so what ended up happening is they created this thing called the Signory system, right? And the Signory system is lordly power, a central strong male, which is like semi-dynastic council of leaders, right? So what it was basically in Florence, for example, there were 9 of them in the Signory, right? There were 9 of them that represented the largest guilds throughout the city, right? And so these 9 electors would come together and they would vote on things to get passed. There had to be an odd number of them, so they never actually had a tie, right? So the thing about it, though, is that what you don't realize behind the scenes is that they're not truly republics. Because under the Signory systems, you had families that were coming in and that were bribing all of them, right? It was like you had the Sforza in Milan, you had the Medici in Florence, which we'll get into here in about 2 seconds, and these groups and different families are going to begin to kind of sway a lot of the different economics that are going on in these different areas. That's the crest of the Medici, that's the one of the Sforza right there. So going into it, though, okay, what you have, though, is the establishment of your earliest Italian communes and your Italian republics, but we'll get into all that stuff in our next flip. And we'll talk about Venice, Milan, Florence, and then we'll talk about the rise of humanism as well. And we'll have that one, and then we'll have one more flip going into the first day of class. But big things that y'all need to do as well, read those articles, start on that LEQ essay. If you need help with that, just email me, and I'll do my best to help you out with it. And then just make sure you get your map done and stuff like that. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.